Okay, so, well, thank you for joining us in this conversation between Robert and Simón, who will be discussing socialist perspectives on Guyana and Venezuela, two neighboring countries that are seldom discussed together. I will introduce them first. Robert Cuffy is a revolutionary socialist who is a co-founder of the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana and a member of the Transnational Solidarity Network. He lives in Brooklyn, works in child welfare, and is a rank and file member of DC 37 Local 371 Union, as well as a member of DC 37 Progressives Caucus. Robert is also a part of the Afro-Socialist Caucus and Labor branch of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. And Simón Rodríguez is a member of the Freedom and Socialism Party of Venezuela and the International Workers' Unity Fourth International, and he is the co-author of ¿Por qué fracasó el chavismo? Or Why Did Chavismo Fail? And he collaborates with VenezuelanVoices.org. So this event is hosted by Venezuelan Workers Solidarity, which is the organization that I am in, Alejandro as well, and Simón as well. Laura is our honorary member as well. By the Transnational Solidarity Network and by the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana. So this conversation will have a format that I will explain first. I have 5 broad questions for each panelist. So each of them will answer in approximately 5 minutes. And after each intervention, we will have some time for them to reply to each other or comment on each other's interventions. And we will give the audience a chance to ask questions as well. So we will have like 5 sections to this talk. So during the talk, please write your questions in the chat so I can see them and transmit them to Robert and Simón after each block of questions. So Robert, Simón, are you ready to start?
Yes, thank you, Elvira.
Okay, so the first question I have for you is, the economies of both Guyana and Venezuela are based on the sale of primary products in the world market. How did the passage from agricultural to extractivist-based economies take place in both countries? And what are the challenges that current modes of production pose for each country? And how, if at all, does it influence the relationship between them? So I don't know, do you want to start, Robert? Simón, you want to start?
I can start.
Okay, Robert.
It's just me having trouble unmuting myself. All right. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you again for having me as part of this conversation. And hopefully it's the beginning of building solidarity across borders, especially as our various national rulers try to pit us against each other. And I wanted to thank Elvira for moderating and Simón for being here and the comrades from Venezuelan Voices, as well as the Transnational Solidarity Network for making this happen. To respond directly to the question about extractivism, I think it's important to note that, you know, the challenge of this concept of selling primary products on the world market, the main challenge posed is the fact that as we sell these primary products, the commodity prices are subject to fluctuation. And so too then the national incomes of our countries fluctuate as well, and pushes us into the imperialist debt trap with groups like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and emerging actors like the Import-Export Bank of China. And it's a reflection of the lack of organic industrial development in places like Guyana, or what Walter Rodney would call a deliberate underdevelopment. In Guyana, historically, our main export from colonial times well into the present has been agricultural products and sugar mostly. And even as early as the 19th century, when competitors like beet sugar led to a plummeting in the price of cane sugar on the world market, it took subsidies from Europe to keep the sugar industry afloat. And one of those subsidies in the form of preferential prices by the United Kingdom and later the European Union is something that has been lost today with the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, or Brexit as it's called. But the underdevelopment in Guyana, at least by the British, also has another dimension insofar as we lack the labor saving technology that's developed alongside the advance of capitalism to extract the natural wealth. So we then have to rely upon multinational corporations like Exxon to extract the recently found oil wealth in Guyana. And in a parallel to the Venezuelan experience, part of what we've done to kind of make Guyana attractive to this multinational corporation is that we've entered into a contractual agreement with them that's grossly unfair to the Guyanese people. And this is a form of what the Marxists would call offering a low ground rent, right? Like you're not actually putting any significant amount of taxes on this corporation to allow it to have as much free reign as possible. In fact, Exxon has made clear that the Guyanese people should not expect, for example, employment in the oil industry in any significant numbers as part of its operations there. And again, this is the underlying problem, whether it's oil or sugar. And so I wanted to share a brief quote from the Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney, who was prescient enough to speak to this very dichotomy. And this is in a speech called The Crisis in the Periphery. And I think a country like Guyana, which has less than 1 million people and does not have industrial development, is firmly located within the periphery of the capitalist system. So Rodney says, quote, "With oil, as with sugar, despite the seeming differences, the choice of product is still the choice made from the imperialist center. The rationale for production is still derived from the central economies, from the metropolitan core economies. The market is still external to the area of production. It is still the old pattern of the export of a primary good, the export of that which the economy does not really consume. And it is clear that what has happened in the past is that dependence on development has tended to create the illusion of growth at various stages," end quote. So I think we are, especially in an era now in Guyana, where there's been an intensified political struggle, a polarization of our society across racial lines that culminated with the election held in March of this year, and the results only declared in August, given the People's Progressive Party a victory, and subsequent to that, major racial unrest and murders of racially motivated murders in the country. So I think all of that goes back to this underlying economic issue that we are unable to have an indigenous bourgeoisie of any sort, any indigenous production with which this country can stand economically on its own. And until we find a way to build links across borders, to have an economy of solidarity, this is the lot we're left with, because we're, again, whether it's sugar yesterday or oil today, selling primary products on the world market.
Thank you so much, Robert. Simón.
Yes, in the case of Venezuela, this transit from an agricultural-based economy onto an oil exporting economy, it happened over the first half of the 20th century. Venezuela has been an oil exporter for roughly more than a century, and this transition from agriculture to oil led to massive social changes in Venezuela. We had what we call the rural exodus, which was basically the masses of peasants moving into the shanty towns of the major cities looking for work because there was this huge shift in the economy. Venezuela became for a moment it was the top oil exporter in the world. During the Second World War, for example, Venezuela was assumed this role as the supplier for all of the war machine of the US and some of the West, and so in the world economy, Venezuela assumed then on this role as a supplier, a safe supplier of oil for the capitalist economy, in a relation that is semi-colonial, because most of the extraction was done actually by foreign companies, Rockefeller, Shell, British Petroleum, all of these huge transnational companies were actually doing all of the extraction, commercialization of the oil. And when it began in the 1920s to be a major sector of the Venezuelan economy, it was under the dictatorship of Gomez, a military dictatorship, and the conditions were so terrible that this man that was working in the economy ministry, he did the math, and he figured out that if we had given away the oil, just not charge a single dollar for the oil, but rather charge the customs taxes that for all of the machinery and all that was imported by these companies, it would have been a better deal. The tax cuts that the big companies got were so big that it was the business for the Venezuelan state was worse than if the oil would have been simply given away. Well, a century later, we are arriving at a similar situation. Of course, there's a huge process in between, because in the 1970s, there was a nationalization of the oil industry by a social democrat government. In the 90s, it again was privatized. It was called the oil opening. It was done by Rafael Caldera government, a social Christian government. And then came Chavismo, which came into power amongst big hopes of social change, democratic participation, social justice. And one of the key promises that Chavismo made was that it would nationalize again the oil, that the oil would again be for, or in a real sense, it would be for Venezuelans. It would be even a superior nationalization to that of the 70s. And yet Chavismo failed at this basic promise. It never nationalized oil. What it did is it changed the contracts that were given to foreign multinationals into mixed enterprise associations, basically mixed capital partnerships between the Venezuelan state and the multinational companies. But because of, well, a long process of not investing in the oil industry, these 20 years of Chavismo, Chavismo has seen in the oil industry simply the possibility to loot and take away riches without a long-term strategy of investing. And so we have arrived at a situation where Venezuela has to import petrol, has to import gas. It has changed from being one of the largest, and for a lot of time, one of the largest oil exporters, to having drastically dropping its production. Venezuela is currently exporting perhaps 15% of what it was exporting 20 years ago, maybe around 400,000 barrels a day, while 20 years ago, it was around 3 million barrels a day. And of course, this has the drop in production has sharpened because of the US sanctions, the oil sanctions applied last year by the Trump administration, which have certainly hurt greatly the Venezuelan economy. But if you see the evolution of production and also the evolution of the Venezuelan economy as a whole, actually the conditions were deteriorating even as the oil price was above $100 a barrel. I mean, very high prices because of the simply the looting policies of Chavismo through all kinds of distortions, like having a very distorted exchange rate, which led to massive corruption and capital flight. So we are getting to a situation where now to try to reactivate the oil industry, the Maduro, once again, a military civilian dictatorship like we had 100 years ago, is trying to give incentives so huge to foreign capital that we can say that we are getting again at conditions like the ones we had a century ago, where even we have this law that has been approved recently. It's called an anti-blockade law, because it's supposed to be a counterweight to the so-called US blockade. But what it actually does is to allow the Venezuelan government to give away concessions for oil exploitation in secret contracts in conditions that are not known to the Venezuelan people, to have a parallel budget. This money will not go into the normal budget of the country, but in a secret and specific budget. The labor conditions can they can be outside of what the labor law established. It's basically a supra-constitutional law, as it is called, as if all of these negotiations can be carried out in a totally independent framework from what the law and the Constitution establishes. So that is 100 years in 10 minutes, but we can say that unfortunately the massive wealth was through all of this time basically benefiting the oil industry, the big oil multinationals, in all of these different governments, be they military, civilian, bourgeois, democratic, or dictatorships or not. Always the governments tried to use the oil wealth to inject it into a national bourgeoisie in order for it to develop. And this development model has failed once and again. We need, of course, a truly socialist and democratic planification of the economy in order for this wealth to be really invested in developing the economies, what we think.
Thank you, Simón. I don't know if Robert would like to respond to this, or if we should ask the audience if they have any questions, or if you have any comments for Robert, Simón.
I would just like to add one quick thing,
Yes.
which is that in talking about the role of these commodities on the world market, like one thing I think we forgot to mention in our current historical moment is the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis plunged the price for oil worldwide, right? To the extent that the oil producers were even struggling to find places to store oil that they were pulling up. And at least in the Guyanese perspective, where we have not fully moved from an agricultural economy into like an oil extractivist one, and put a huge pause on those operations, because like this is the year, for example, that they were really supposed to start pulling the oil from the ground. And this is why there was such a protracted, polarized, and long fight over state power in Guyana, because it was about which parts of the petty bourgeois ruling class would be able to win the spoils from the incoming oil wealth. But we're seeing a very practical example of what it means to trade in these primary products on the world market with the COVID-19 inspired economic crisis plunging the price of oil. So it's very much history giving us a cautionary tale as to the problems with selling primary products in the world market.
Do we have any questions from anyone in the audience right now? I don't see anything in the chat. Rocio?
Hi, thank you so much for the talk so far. I had a question for Simón. So I wanted to ask you, what is the situation with Venezuela's agriculture? Because one of the things that's been shocking to me that's hard to relate to other people is that people, when we talk about the economic crisis, that Venezuela imports so much of its food from Colombia. That's been a big part of like the economic crisis. And if you could just talk about why that is, because like you said, Venezuela used to be an agricultural state. There's nothing really that different about Venezuela. Has a lot of land. So really it makes no sense except that Venezuela is like, doesn't, especially that a so-called socialist government wouldn't have nationalized, like that they would not have built up their food capacity. From what I understand, it's because they went it just put all capital from agriculture to oil, and then it didn't diversify the economy. So if you could talk about that.
Simón, do you want to answer? Because it goes a little into the next question about what was really the socialist character of the Bolivarian government. So perhaps you could include a little bit about what happened with why do we have a food crisis in Venezuela? Like what happened to the agricultural sector and what state it is right now? Or would you like to answer now, Simón?
Well, just a quick comment, because as the Venezuela has plunged into ruin in the last 5 years, a sector that has begun to grow rapidly is the gold extraction in the south, in the forests, Amazonian forests, and especially, and this is also affecting Guyana, because part of the mining is done by these informal groups, paramilitary groups, and certainly it's a big problem, environmental degradation and so on. So as the oil goes into total crisis in Venezuela, then again the answer is more extractivism, not less. And regarding the problem of agriculture, to say it in a very simple way, when the government has this huge rent, because either through direct exploitation of oil or because of the taxes it charges the multinationals, it has a big income. Then it is the state who supplies the foreign currency to private enterprises for their imports. In a fairly rational way, what should happen is that you should give foreign currency to import machines and things that are necessary to produce in Venezuela. But the government realizes that if it gives cheap currency, if it sells the dollars cheap, it's a form of clientelism to keep the bourgeoisie happy. In a way, it perhaps also keep the prices low for consumers. So there is this temptation to sell as cheap as possible the dollars. Chavismo took this to the extreme. So this affects agriculture because it then becomes cheaper to import food, and it's a better business to import food with cheap dollars than to produce food in Venezuela. And this has totally ruined the Venezuelan agriculture. And as I said, all governments to a certain degree came to with this problem. In economy, they call it the Dutch disease. But Chavismo, we call it the Chavista disease, is multiplied by 1,000.
Thank you, Simon. We have another question, but I think we can maybe address it in the next, after you answer the next one. Okay, so my second question for both of you is, can you speak to the success of socialist projects in Guyana and Venezuela? In previous conversations that we've had, you have addressed some clear similarities between the Burnham and the Chavista government as being discursively constructed as socialist and anti-imperialist, but behaving very differently in practice. So what is your critique of these regimes, and can you comment maybe about the role of the international left in upholding or supporting these regimes? And I think that when you answer that, perhaps you can address some of the questions that we have in the chat, but let's hear what you have to say first. So, Robert?
Thanks. So I think this is a very important question, precisely because there's so many misconceptions on the left about socialist projects in Guyana and Venezuela. And I think it's appropriate that I go first, because our socialist project in Guyana is way behind this. I mean, technically, according to the Guyanese constitution, we're a cooperative socialist country. And even one of the leading parties, in fact, the current party that's in power, the People's Progressive Party, still has a quote unquote Marxist-Leninist constitution. But there are very few working people in Guyana who would say that the country is socialist now. And there are very few working people who lived through the 70s and 80s under socialism, and that socialism with quotes, who would speak positively to it. And I think one of the major differences between the socialist regimes in Guyana and Venezuela, in addition to the fact that Guyanas came about in the 70s and 80s, whereas Chavismo and 21st century socialism, Bolivarianism took hold in the 21st century, is the fact of how they came to power, whereas there was like, this mass movement that beat back a coup that put Chavez on the map. Whereas in Guyana, the political party, the People's National Congress, and its leader, Forbes Burnham, they came to power through an abortion or a co-option of our national liberation struggle, because as that struggle gained steam in the 1950s through the leadership of the People's Progressive Party and its leader, Cheddi Jagan, and Forbes Burnham, who was part of the People's Progressive Party at the time, posed a challenge to British colonialism. The response from the British was to militarily occupy Guyana and to jail the leaders who had won the first election under universal suffrage. And through this military occupation, through the intervention of the CIA with reactionary labor strikes, there became a split in the People's Progressive Party along racial lines between Guyanese of Indian descent and Guyanese of African descent. And that's what the People's National Congress represented, a split with Forbes Burnham claiming to represent Guyanese of African descent. And if you look into like the records that have since been released from the CIA and from Scotland Yard, they say, for example, that they chose Burnham because he seemed the most opportunist of the two leaders and the one most likely to prevent a quote unquote Cuban scenario, because the Cuban Revolution of the late 50s was something on the minds of the imperialists as well, that they were trying to prevent another version of. So when Forbes Burnham and the United Force Party, which represented the country's business interests at the time, came to power in 1966, they came to power actually as a conservative government. And it was only later in the 1970s, as a way to preempt unrest and struggle happening within the working class and the challenge from the People's Progressive Party, that the People's National Congress under Forbes Burnham made a declaration of cooperative socialism with the principle of the paramountcy of the party, the People's National Congress, over the state and all things in the country, to the point that even the police force was expected to be quote unquote socialist. And this had major, this had major consequences on the international left because it kind of, we were quote unquote in a socialist country, but the country, the leadership remained in power through a series of fraudulent elections. And when they were challenged in this and challenged by showing that the economic and social conditions of the working class in Guyana had not changed under this cooperative socialism, there was repression against dissidents like those within the Working People's Alliance and Walter Rodney himself, who was eventually assassinated by the Burnham regime. So I think to go back to the point of exporting primary products in the world market, we had a government that called itself socialist, but the economic basis of the society had remained the same. And the export of primary products on the world market remained the principal economic activity of the country. Moreover, in the 1970s, the economic crisis of capitalism reasserted itself in another of the acute crises that are periodic, like the one we're going through now. And it laid bare that in a country that called itself socialist, there was starvation happening. To add to that, the Burnham government embarked on a program of self-sufficiency to say that the Guyanese people should only produce what they could eat under a policy called produce or perish. And given that Guyana is a country that doesn't produce wheat, for example, it meant we had no flour. And people were forced to use something called plantain flour. And no disrespect to people who like plantain flour, but it could not be produced in the numbers to feed the masses. So one of the things that happened during these times was that Guyanese people would go across the border to Brazil and to Venezuela to get the goods we couldn't produce and bring back in under what we call contraband times. We would go across the border to get contraband. And it's very, when talking about Guyana and Venezuela, it's almost like we share parallel histories, right? Because now that Venezuela is in this economic, social, and political crisis, we see Venezuelans crossing the border, coming to Guyana. We have about 17,000 Venezuelans in Guyana. That's the official record, not counting those who didn't register with immigration services. So I'd like to end then by saying that the other aspect of like a socialist regime, right, in a country in the periphery of capitalism, and for all intents and purposes, a poor country, is that it's trying to reverse in some ways what's been forced upon us by imperialism, which is this underdevelopment of our economy. But they're not doing it through involving the masses of people in a struggle that can connect with other working class people throughout the world and in the region. What they're trying to do is themselves build an organic and indigenous bourgeoisie, and the nationalizations that they carry out are in a way to give shelter to this process of development. And in Venezuela, it's been much more successful with the creation of the Bali bourgeoisie. But even in Guyana, like the Working People's Alliance, Walter Rodney's party pointed out that the nationalizations of the sugar and bauxite industries, for example, or for all intents and purposes, selling the resources, or rather giving the resources of the Guyanese people away, because we, the Guyanese people, are the ones who built these corporations and made them successful through the exploitation of our labor. In his book, A History of the Guyanese Working People, for example, Walter Rodney did this painstaking historical analysis to show the ways in which Guyana's coastline, which is where the most of the people live, the infrastructure there was created by African slaves using their hands and shovels to literally dig canals to create a system of irrigation that makes the place livable and that make agriculture work. So to then say that we will give the multinational corporations that owned the sugar industry millions of dollars in exchange for taking it over is selling the Guyanese people wealth. But more than that, the technological issues remain the same, right? That we didn't have the technology, the expertise, and the know-how to run these industries. So we then had to resort to hiring managers from those multinational corporations to come back and work at the nationalized industries. So the socialism, in many ways, it's the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, where we're saying working class people should take mastery over our society, that every cook can govern, or in this case, every cane cutter can govern. It's, for all intents and purposes, trying to, in many ways in vain, build up our national bourgeoisie. And the reality is that the imperialists simply won't let us, and the economic patterns of development continue to follow dictation from the imperialist centers. Like, one of the best examples of this in Guyana is the fact that we have no train system, right? We don't have a transport system by rail. And the only transport system by rail that ever existed is one that ran on the east coast of Guyana from plantation to plantation to plantation. And when the British pulled out, they just left that rail system to rot. And like, so there's an area in Guyana now called the High Line, which is a highway and also a place people hang out that runs along that old railway. And it's like the only remnant we have of that train line, but there's no development of a transportation infrastructure within the country. So like, one great example of this lack of infrastructure, the place I'm from in Guyana called Bartica, which is considered the gateway to the interior, where you go do mining, logging, and other activities, and which is at the confluence of the Cayuni and Mazaruni rivers, and it's the Cayuni River that separates Guyana and Venezuela. Even though Bartica is not an island, the most efficient way for me to travel there after arriving in Georgetown is to take a boat. Because again, there's not been the development that we can use in an organic fashion to build out society. And the alternative we have then is that our governments continually turn to imperialist sources of funding at rates of interest we can't afford, to the point that Guyana's gross domestic product, our GDP, we pay 40% of that towards repaying loans. And as a result, they balance the books in the country through crippling levels of austerity by one of the things they do is denationalize, right? They can no longer afford the nationalization. So the bauxite industry has been denationalized. The sugar industry has been hugely contracted. When I was growing up, there was a thing called the Guyana Electrical Company that's been privatized. The Guyana Water Company has been privatized. And all of the seeming gains of nationalization have been pushed back. And it shows that socialism cannot be equated with nationalization, but certainly not nationalization with compensation. And it really shows the challenge of a concept of a socialism existing in only one country, because in country after country where these socialisms exist, the crisis of capitalism comes back and reclaims the gains and even the state ownership over the means of production back to privatization.
Thank you, Robert. Simón?
Yes, so there are, as Robert pointed out, historical differences as to the development of these so-called socialist projects by sectors of the bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie. In the case of Chavismo, Venezuela is a post-Cold War scenario. And so to understand why Chavismo started to call itself a socialist or to proclaim socialism as its project, we have to also remember that Chavismo did not start as a self-proclaimed socialist project. First, it came into into public light because of this military failed rebellion in 1992. To understand why this happened, also we have to go a little bit further back into 1989, where there was this massive popular uprising called El Caracazo, in which the slums of Caracas took to the streets, massive looting, defying the military repression. It's calculated that around 2,000 people were killed, and this sort of put the last nail into the coffin of this bipartisan regime that had been in power in Venezuela since the end of the military dictatorship in the 50s. So these rebellions, there were two of them in 1992, were an expression of the crisis in the military sector that resulted from this broader political crisis, and especially the massive repression of 1989. He was in jail, Chavez, for 2 years, and then evolved into an electoral project which eventually won the elections in 1998. But it did not win the elections on a socialist platform, and the conspiratory military group was also not socialist. Basically, it had some very blurry, very general nationalist rhetoric, taking as its references 19th century patriotic heroes like Simón Bolívar, but certainly nothing to do with socialism. Even it rejected explicitly the perspective of socialism in a more postmodern theoretical framework. But the reality is that there was this social process of organizing independent unions, of mobilization of the popular sectors demanding real democratic political participation and so on. So the Chavismo movement rode on top of that historical process. And that's what explains why, although in 1998, Chavez came to power talking about the third way, Anthony Giddens, Tony Blair, that's what he was talking about. But quickly he began to radicalize in the same way that class struggle was radicalizing. There was the coup attempt in 2002, which briefly took Chavez out of power, and it was a massive rebellion that defeated this pro-US coup. But only in 2004 did Venezuela break military relations with the US, expelling the military representation of the US in the main fort in Caracas, Fuerte Tiuna. And only in 2005 and 2006, that is 7 years into government, that Chavez started to say, well, we should discuss the basis for a new type of socialism, a 21st century socialism, which will be different from all previous socialisms. And we have to invent it. We have to give it our own content. And in the end, what it did is basically adapt the concept of 20th century socialism into the new status quo. So it basically came to say, well, the new socialism is to have medical assistance in the barrio, or to have free education, which are things that we already, in the case of education, we had public and free education from decades ago. It wasn't something that was gained by Chavismo. So it was this very general thing, and certainly a class collaboration process, because this new type of socialism could include not only the national bourgeoisie, but even the transnational companies. At some point, Chavez talked about an oil-based socialism in which transnationals could play a positive role. And in this process of capital flight and transferring the oil-rich to all of the oil wealth into the bourgeoisie. For example, General Motors, which had an assembly plant in Venezuela, received more than $6 billion of very cheap dollars. So there was this massive transferring of wealth to even this type of US companies at the same time that the government was talking about socialism. So really, we have to say it has nothing to do with socialism. And regarding the nationalizations that were done, which were not in the oil sector, which is the main sector of the Venezuelan economy, but rather in other sectors of secondary importance, they were paid in market price deals. For example, there was this Bank of Venezuela, which was privatized in the 90s, and then it was bought back again by the Chavista government. But when it was privatized, the Spanish bank that bought it paid roughly $300 million. And when Chavez bought it again, he paid more than $1 billion. So the Spanish bankers were very happy to have this type of deals in this type of socialism. They even declared that it was one of the best deals they have ever made in their lives. Basically, to underline the fact that Venezuela never challenged capitalism, never challenged, in the economic sense, imperialism, even though it took to some extent, independent decisions in its foreign policy. It made alliances with countries like Cuba, Iran, China, which may have competition or frictions or conflicts with the US. So there was a political shift, but in the economic sense, there was not. Even Venezuela was its main client, its main destination for oil exports was the US up until the Trump sanctions in 2019. And most of the Venezuelan imports came from the US up to the point of the sanctions. So there was a very sharp divide between the official rhetoric and the political discourse, for one hand, and in the other, really what was happening in the economy of capitalist Venezuela.
Thank you, Simón. Do we have any questions from the audience right now? Okay, we don't have any right now. Robert, would you like to add anything to what Simón said or reply in some way to his intervention?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive and covers it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna ask the next question, which touches upon maybe the most, I don't know, like the root of the problem maybe between Guyana and Venezuela. The question is, how are, or if they're not, why not? How are national identities in Guyana and Venezuela constructed around either anti-Guyanese or anti-Venezuelan sentiment? And perhaps in a broader sense, share with us your view of how the othering of Guyanese and Venezuelans takes place on each opposite side, whether through the discourse of power or in the media or as a sort of public sentiment. And this could also be a good opportunity for you to reflect on how socialism fits into national identities. So, Robert.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so
we're losing you for a
Venezuelan comrades.
Okay, you're back.
Okay, is this any better?
Yes.
My internet was unstable for a second. Yeah, so I'll say this from a Guyanese perspective, and hopefully the Venezuelan comrades can let me know if it makes sense to them. But within Guyana, even though there's a certain anti-Venezuelanism, most people couldn't tell you, for example, what is the capital of Venezuela? Or what are some towns and cities in Venezuela? Attitudes really based upon projections of each other coming from above, at least to me, from the ruling class. So I know in some of what I've said thus far, it's been more of like technical and theoretical things. I'll just try to share like some stories from growing up to like give some context to this, right? So I came to the US in 2002. Before that, in the year 2000, that would mean I was around like 13, 14. The Guyana police force, like crime had started to become a thing in Guyana, but like this is the incident everyone remembers as the big salvo of Guyana kind of deteriorating into a drug state, which is that the Guyana police force in the year 2000 cornered a notorious criminal who was referred to as Blackie in the Toucan Suites apartment building about 2 villages away from where I lived. And apparently this criminal had like some really damaging information on government officials with whom he was alleged to work. And the police were determined to get to him. And even though this was like a private piece of property, they evacuated everyone but Blackie and just like bombed the shit out of this place. Like the pictures of it is just rubble, but like 2 villages away, all I could hear, all my family and my neighbors we could hear was bombs and gunshots, right? So as we're like all huddling together, scared, the question comes up, what is happening? And the first thought that came to everyone's mind was Venezuela is invading. And why do we think Venezuela is invading? Well, I'll get to that. But like, for context, Venezuela claims in the border dispute with Guyana, the county of Essequibo. And we were so far away from the county of Essequibo and the Essequibo River that where we lived was actually like a few blocks away from the Demerara River. And where I grew up, the area was so underdeveloped that the system of municipal garbage collection and sanitation was so non-existent. We were advised that instead of just dumping your garbage into any old piece of land as a landfill, dump your garbage, and I know this sounds ridiculous, into one of the nearby canals, which feed the sugar plantations and are emptied into the Demerara River. And every time I would do this as a kid, taking out the garbage, you'd throw the garbage over the rail, and these ugly fish called carass would bubble to the top and start eating at your garbage. And the carass themselves, regardless of whether they do or not eat garbage, were considered garbage fish because they're bottom feeders. So in the construction of Guyana's national identity, nothing is more important than this folk song we have called Not a Blade of Grass. And it goes like, we're not giving up no mountains, we're not giving up no sea, not a blade of grass, not one carass. And it's really a song about the threat of Venezuelan invasion. But like this symbol of the carass is this lowly bottom feeder, but the Venezuelans will not even have a carass, really goes to show the extent to which Guyanese national identity has been developed through anti-Venezuelanism. And this anti-Venezuelanism has always been like a latent part of Guyanese identity, but it has really come to the fore and taken on really and truly a xenophobic character as the border dispute intensifies over the recent oil discoveries off the coast of Guyana.
Sobre todo en estos últimos años, cuando se descubren yacimientos petroleros en la costa guyanesa y se intensifica.
Off the coast of Guyana, which has led to these like intense battles between the Guyanese and Venezuelan ruling classes. Like in the last few years, for example, the Venezuelan government has landed a helicopter on an Exxon oil rig, right? There's been shootouts between Guyanese and Venezuelan military forces along the border. And of course, this is something that the United States imperialists are trying to used as a crux against the Venezuelan government, with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, recently making a visit to Guyana along these lines. But at the end of the day, most Guyanese have never met a Venezuelan person. Guyanese people refer to Venezuelans as Venese. So there's a conception that the Venese are here for this and the Venese are here for that. But it's quite ironic because in Guyana, where we have our like middling population of less than 1 million people, we have about the same number of Guyanese people living in other countries as immigrants and residents, right? And it's to the extent that Guyana's GDP, about 15% of the annual GDP, is made up by remittances from immigrants in other countries. So like the irony of anti-immigrant racism in Guyana, when the country is itself, like, you know, we depend on access to other countries for our social mobility. It really goes to show how insidious the anti-Venezuelanism is. Now, as a part of our national identity, I don't think the concept of socialism really fits in, but I do think it's telling that under our socialist government, there was no meaningful attempts at amelioration of this conflict and dispute between Guyanese and Venezuelan people, because isn't that what socialism is supposed to be? About building struggles across borders. But there is also no meaningful attempts by this socialist government to make contact with the Venezuelan working people and their representative organizations, their trade unions, organizations for people of color and indigenous people in Venezuela. None of this was done, which kind of gives an indicator of the fraud of the type of socialism being put forward. So because of the period, the contraband period, there has been some connection between Guyanese and Venezuelan people. And there is some very good solidarity being built where there are everyday Guyanese people who seek to help Venezuelan migrants, because the response of the government has been one to detain Venezuelan migrants. There's an especially patriarchal approach to Venezuelan sex workers, who they all assume are being trafficked. And their way of helping the trafficked women is to detain them as well. And there are even women in the Guyanese government who won like international acclaim for fighting trafficking by doing this very same thing of arresting Venezuelan sex workers. But there are like people building meaningful levels of solidarity. And I remember a few years ago, I read something from a high school student who had a Guyanese father and a Venezuelan mother, and talked about how learning that they were Venezuelan, they were ostracized in school. But this person then picked up on what is meaningful and good in both Guyanese and Venezuelan traditions, not necessarily radical traditions, but you know, what makes people human, against this kind of othering. So I do think that as the struggle intensifies, the natural solution is for people to find allies instead of enemies in each other. And the natural process of the class struggle is going to push this forward, even though in the current historical moment that xenophobia has not necessarily come forward. But so just lastly, I want to say the anti-Venezuelanism is like such an assumed part of the Guyanese. Even when Guyanese people are in moments of resistance, it comes out. So last month in Guyana, or was it in August? A couple of months ago in Guyana, there was this racist murder of two young boys, two young teens called the Henry Boys. And there was a lot of like international outcry against it, because not only were they murdered for like a seemingly ridiculous thing, like allegedly stealing coconuts from neighbors, they were hacked to death with machetes, cutlasses as we call them. And there were like markings left all over their body. One of them had an X written on their face. And then in retaliation, there was a killing of an Indo-Guyanese teenager named Harish Singh. So here in Brooklyn, we had a protest about it, a really good militant protest. I loved it. Like I showed up to the protest, and like one of the person leading the chants was singing an old Guyanese folk song that said, "Oh, Kanji Wata, them sing and go away. talking about the 1763 Berbice slave rebellion in what is now Guyana against the Dutch colonists. But it quickly turned to, we ain't giving up no country, we ain't giving up no land, not a blade of grass, not one karass. And like that was literally the song that came after. So even in, standing up for Black Lives Matter in Guyana and justice for the Henry Boys, this concept of anti-Venezuelanism, both conscious and subconscious, seeps in, because like that's how, what does it mean to be Guyanese? It's hard to tell when you live in the periphery in a country with very small amounts of people. But we know one thing, we're against those Venezuelans.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. Simón?
Yes, it's very, very interesting, and we should find out the way for there to be more exchanges like this, because really there is little knowledge really on the level of the people in both sides of the frontier as to what is the reality on the other side, and even what the people on the other side think about you, right? I don't think that too many Venezuelans really take seriously or as much more than really theatrical and buffonesque threats, all that Maduro says or the right-wing opposition says when they say they are going to claim back the Essequibo region. For Venezuela, for example, Venezuela is giving away this region that is called the Orinoco Mining Arc, which is more than 100,000 square kilometers to mining by foreign companies. So we are giving away our territory to transnational interests. Certainly, we're not in a position to claim sovereignty over other territories when we are giving away the one that is recognized by all countries. It's really an irony. But as I was saying, really, this we are taught in primary school that this territory belongs to Venezuela. Even we have a map where it is drawn. It's called like the reclamation zone. It's not an important part of the Venezuelan identity at all. And just to give an example of why I am saying this, there is not a single important literary work or film or any expression of culture in which the belonging of the Essequibo to Venezuela is highlighted, or that it has anything to do with that. So certainly we actually don't have it into our identity. It's a very different situation, for example, as to what happens in Argentina with the Malvinas Islands, which you talk to any ordinary Argentinian person and they will explain why those islands are Argentinians and were stolen by the British. And in the case of Venezuela, why is it Venezuelan, this territory? Well, no one will give a clear explanation onto that. Would you be willing to go and invade this territory? Probably not. Do you know who lives there? Do you know what is the population of the Essequibo region? What language do the people who live there speak? Well, really, most Venezuelans know nothing about this territory, and it's just some vague thing that they learned when they went to school in primary school, that there is this piece of land that was lost along the way. Just so that it is understood in its proper context, there is, and well, especially was in the later half of the 20th century, some important immigration from Colombia. And so the Venezuelan bourgeoisie did create an important sentiment of xenophobia against Colombian poor working class immigrants, associating crime and drug trafficking with the Colombian immigrants. And also there is this representation of Venezuela as a big project when it came into independence with Bolivar in the 19th century, and that it had a lot of territory, but it lost it. It lost it to one part to the British in what is now Guyana, and one part to an important, and perhaps it's talked more about, what was lost supposedly to Colombia. The reality of the borders of Venezuela is that in the 19th century, when Venezuela came into life as an independent country, all of these borders were mostly uninhabited, and the Venezuelan bourgeoisie had no possibility to enforce borders. And so through the decades, as demographic factors started to shape the real boundaries, then the real boundaries came to be different than what perhaps the first Venezuelans thought that the borders should be. But that's the reality of how borders come into being. You can have an abstract idea of what your country should be as a ruling class, but then it depends on whether you actually exercise state control over the territory. And so going into the conflict as such, really from the time of the Dutch colonization of Guyana, then the English, there were conflicts, and there were different versions of what the border should be. There were some claims to even to the Orinoco basin by Dutch and English colonizers, which saw it as a very strategic and important place to take hold of. And finally, in the end of the 19th century, there came disagreement in a Paris agreement that set what is right now the border. There's an article I wrote on this, which is in venezuelanvoices.org, which I go more into the history. And basically the conclusion for me is that, and for socialists in this left opposition in Venezuela like me, is that we should turn the page on this, that it's in the best interest of the Venezuelan working class and of the Guyanese working class and of solidarity and brotherhood of our Caribbean peoples, for really to Venezuela to accept that although it had been a legitimate claim against the British Empire, at the moment that Guyana became an independent country, it has only been a claim that has been manipulated by US imperialism and by even the British imperialism as well, and by the Venezuelan bourgeoisie and by the Guyanese bourgeoisie, against the true and real interests of peoples in both sides of the frontier. Of course, saying this in Venezuela can make you be pointed as a traitor to the national interest, but really we see national interests through a class glass, and we put first the interest of the working class and of course of the international working class first. And we think that through all of these points of view, the view of what is more important for the emancipation of the Venezuelan working class right now struggling against a dictatorship, what is in the interest of the Guyanese working class to not be distracted by this mainly false threat of Venezuelan nationalism. We can concentrate on our real problems and in this sense, get rid of a distraction and get rid of this ridiculous conflict, which now is ridiculous. If you took it to the last consequences, meaning war, it's really an absurd and a criminal thing to even consider. So that's our position as a left opposition socialist in Venezuela, that really this claim has to be dropped by the Venezuelan state.
Thank you, Simón. We have two questions, one from Javier and one from Laura. I don't know if there are any questions about this issue of Venezuela and Guyana relations.
I have another question, Sam.
Yes, yes, Sam, go ahead.
I just wonder if Robert could elaborate on the attitude of his people to the other Guyanas.
So I can respond to that very quickly. So again, like part of the issue here is that the majority of Guyanese live on the Atlantic coast, right? So the borders we share with Suriname, formerly Dutch Guyana, and with Venezuela and Brazil, in those areas, those are the most remote parts of Guyana. So even though there is like cross-border trade and that people come across the border, there's not a lot of direct connection in like the major centers of the country, like in Georgetown, the capital, with people from other countries. So there's not really, like Guyanese people, for example, go on vacation in Suriname, right? Without a problem, they love it there. They love to go see Paramaribo, the capital. But there's not really like an interaction or a flow of people. Likewise with Brazilians, I think Simón mentioned, for example, informal mining that happens like in Guyana with the emancipation of slavery. One of the things the formerly enslaved Africans did was head off into the interior, into doing their own kind of prospecting or gold mining, and they're referred to as pork knockers in reference to the dried salted pork they would take with them as food. So like pork knockers in Guyana and people who work in the bush have relationship with Venezuelans and Brazilians. Like one of my uncles, who's deceased now, was like he worked in the interior to the extent that during contraband times he would be in Brazil so much that he learned to speak Portuguese. But I don't know, for example, any relatives who can speak Dutch from their travels to Suriname, but like I have like a high school friend who's since moved to Suriname to live as a way to like, you know, achieve social mobility. And I just wanted to say in response to Simón, part of the prospects of like a military invasion of Guyana is that like it would give the US the pretext it needed to launch military strikes against Venezuela, because Guyana has no army for all intents and purposes. Like we have the Guyana Defense Force, but like it's such a sparse thing that, for example, another personal story, like I had an uncle who was in Bartica, where I'm from, and he was sick, right? And he needed to come to Georgetown for medical care. And we knew when he came because his son, who's now like a high-ranking member of the Guyana Prison Service, was able to arrange for a helicopter for him to come. But like helicopters are so few and far in between that when we heard a helicopter, we're like, oh, Uncle Shalto's here. So like imagine Venezuela with its actual military forces invading a country like this, where we have a grand total of maybe now 5 helicopters, no planes, some boats, and like it would just be like, it would look so bad that it would be the perfect pretext, which is why there's not been an actual invasion.
Thank you, Robert. We have Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Yes, I don't want to turn the conversation into a direction that, you know, away from where we are right now, unless it seems appropriate to the speakers. I live in Brooklyn, and I have Guyanese neighbors, and I have, so I was curious to know, is there a Guyanese community? Is there a left Guyanese community? I know that among the Haitians here, for example, also in my neighborhood in Crown Heights, there are some people who came out of the Lavala movement in Haiti. And it's useful, and it can be important for building international ties, for showing solidarity, to be able to be knowledgeable, a little bit knowledgeable about, to be able to relate to locate, to be in touch with people from countries, obviously from any country abroad, but particularly those where we're concerned about either US imperialism or the character of the regime and how to support democratic movements there and so on. About Venezuela, my impression is that the Venezuelans who are very public in New York that I see, except for the ones on this call, tend to be more conservative. And my experience with the Nicaraguans here that I have had some dealings with was that they were mostly supporting the democracy movement and not particularly right-wing in essence, though there were a few, So, but I just wondered if this doesn't turn the conversation now too abruptly from abroad to here or to solidarity from here, I'd be interested in knowing what you think and how one might relate to such, is there a Guyanese community here that one could relate to? Are there Guyanese people who are, have a left character that we might know about and might, obviously all of this is different here during the plague, but.
Thank you. I wonder if Robert and Simón, should I ask the final question, which is about solidarity and what the left looks like in Guyana and Venezuela, and maybe you can respond to Dan's question in your reply to me?
That sounds good.
Okay, so my last question is, what are the main concerns of the working class in Guyana and Venezuela today, and how is the left organizing in these countries to fight for those interests? And more broadly, can you give us a survey of what the left looks like in both countries and what types of feminist, anti-racist, labor, or environmental activism are taking place, and what are the issues that, in your opinion, require crucial solidarity from the international left? And then if you can talk a little about Dan and what Dan has asked. And then when we are done with that, so we don't lose like the thematic line, we can answer Javier and Laura's questions. Is that okay?
Okay. So yeah, so I mean, I'll start off with a big disclaimer and grain of salt, right? I live in Brooklyn. It's been about 2 years since I've been in Guyana, but I do try to keep in touch with comrades there. Like most recently, earlier this summer, with a few young people, both in Guyana and the diaspora, we started this podcast to talk about Guyanese politics, especially navigating around the disputed elections that we had and the history of the country. And the great thing is that there is a generation of young people in Guyana who are looking beyond our version of the two-party system, especially as it's reflective of the racial divide in Guyana between Indo-Guyanese people and African Guyanese people, and the ways in which that actually invisibilizes like the indigenous community, or Amerindians as we call them, in Guyana and their struggles, as well as indigenous people. But like the major thing in Guyana is that there's a polarization of politics along racial and political lines, right? That to the point that you either are a supporter of the People's National Congress or a supporter of the People's Progressive Party. And literally people will tell you, like you can be accused of being one of those things. Like my uncle, who I mentioned before, who had traveled to Brazil, in the 1990s, he had dared to criticize the People's National Congress, ineffective as an opposition. And he was called a quote unquote black Jaganite, which meant he was a black supporter of Chedi Jagan. And like, if you're a black person espousing any type of critique of the black government, they'll look at you and say, you are a PPP, right? Like that is a noun, like that political party is your identity. So it's very hard to break free from this. And I think one of the achievements that happened in Guyana was in 2015, when the People's Progressive Party, which had been in power from 1992 until 2015, and the latter part of their rule was just like chaotic, filled with a series of massacres. In the place I'm from, Bartica, which is a place where we would grow up and leave our doors open as we slept, experience like robberies and killings of business people and police officers by criminals. People were fed up with the government. And the People's National Congress was actually able to cobble together a coalition of groups that got the People's Progressive Party out of power, and they only won by like a few thousand votes. But like my cousin tells this story to me about like the sea change that happened in the country as a result. And she says, for example, there's this tree in the center of the country, of the capital. And for, you know, all the terrible things the British did, they did design Georgetown to be like a beautiful city that was referred to as the Garden City. But in the dispute between the People's National Congress, which ran the local government in Georgetown, and the People's Progressive Party, which ran the national government, a lot of the municipal services did not happen, especially garbage collection. So the popular name for the city became Georgetown, the Garbage City, not the Garden City. But my cousin says, like in the middle of the city, there was this one tree that just stood. Every now and again, it would throw up a leaf or so. But after the new government was elected in 2015, that tree began to sprout flowers, which is just like an example of like the kind of hope people got from that political moment. But that coalition government very quickly betrayed all their promises to their supporters. Like one of the first things they did was to give all their sitting government ministers 50% raises as a way to quote unquote fight corruption, because if they had high salaries, then they couldn't be bought off, allegedly. It's the most ridiculous thing. So like in this polarization, it's then hard for the left to exist, right? But it does exist. And like, to me, one of the most enduring forces is this organization called Red Thread, which is a women's collective that does work along the lines of wages for housework. Like they literally go out and categorize the work women do in the household and petition the government that women should be paid for this work. They're also important support to women who are survivors of domestic violence. And the organization itself is primarily run by those women who are themselves survivors of domestic violence. The last time I was there, I sat down with them as like this group of women who've been around since the time of Walter Rodney's party, and some of them were members of the Working People's Alliance. I have a big poster of Rodney up in their office to like sit down and build with them. And they explained to me that, you know, the polarization is so bad that like you can't even get people to care about issues of some working class people because it's racially tinged. So around this time, the government was shutting down the sugar estates, and as a result, laying off tens of thousands of sugar workers. But because the sugar workers and their union were both primarily peopled by Indo-Guyanese people and are supporters of the People's Progressive Party, the general response amounts of masses was, well, you shouldn't have supported the People's Progressive Party. And look what happened to you now. So I said, for example, why not? Why shouldn't Red Thread at this year's May Day parade, since the May Day parade has seen a unification of the two wings of the union movement, Black and Indian, why don't the women join together and raise the issue of the struggle for the sugar workers? And the woman made clear to me that even though there's been some steps forward in unity in the trade union movement, what the Labor Day parade represented was a parade of men getting drunk and dancing, which makes it an uninvited space for them, right? So like, it's just an example in the ways in which it's hard to have this like independent left course. That pessimism aside, there has been really good improvement in Guyana around issues of women and LGBTQ struggles. So Guyana has been left with this colonial history of two laws by the British, a buggery law, which is just an anti-homosexual, anti-anal sex law that technically also applies to women that they can't have anal sex, and a anti-cross-dressing law. And in the last 2 years, we actually took activists in the LGBTQ community, took the cross-dressing law to the Caribbean Court of Justice and got it struck down. I mean, the whole process of it getting struck down was ridiculous because like the Guyanese government and courts were arguing that the law needed to be in place because it was against cross-dressing for immoral and improper purposes. So like someone asked the judge, what's an improper purpose for cross-dressing? He's like, well, what if a man dresses as a woman and robs a gas station? Like just like really ridiculous examples like that. But it's like, you know, groups like Guyana Trans United got formed. And here in the diaspora, there's a group called the Caribbean Equality Project. that focuses on LGBTQ issue. In 2017, in 2018, the first Pride March was held, which was hugely successful. And in 2017, when the International Women's Strike was happening, when the Caribbean-wide feminist movement Life in Leggings was happening, there was also a March for Girls in Guyana that was coordinated with some comrades down there that was a pretty great success. So there have been positive developments in that mode. There's even a group on Instagram because a lot of the Guyanese people live in the diaspora. So this is how we connect over social media, and social media is being a boost in this. That holds calls on issues of national importance, and like I barely make the threshold for young people because I'll be 35 at the end of this month. But I was invited to one of this call, and there was like over 200 people on this call just discussing the actual problems of race and class in Guyana. So like, if you ask generally what the issue and the most important thing for the working class is in Guyana, it is the racial divide in the working class that's particular to Guyana. And like Walter Rodney in his lifetime said that the chief task of his generation was to break that racial divide. And I firmly believe that remains our chief task as well in this present generation. But I would add to that, one of the divides we need to break as well is the one against Venezuelan people, right? To show that we have partners in solidarity, partners not just in suffering and oppression against the border, but partners in struggle to whom we can turn to and look to. And I'll just end by addressing Dan's point about the Guyanese community and left here. Unfortunately, those divisions within Guyana are reflected. So that rally I was talking about, it happened at Grand Army Plaza. It was a rally of almost exclusively Black people. And and they nicely let me speak, but when I got up to make the point that we need justice, not just for the Henry boys, but justice for Harish Singh, the Indo-Guyanese teenager who was killed in retaliation, it sent a chill through the crowd and people became quiet, right? Because the prevailing notion that was happening there is that we have to take revenge. It's an eye for an eye. We have to take care of our people before we can address the concerns of other people. And so there's even a segregation there's a residential segregation that's reflected here as well. So the majority of Afro-Guyanese people in New York City live in Brooklyn in Flatbush. The majority of Indo-Guyanese people live in Queens in South Ozone Park, in that area. So there's like, so as part of the Socialist Workers Alliance, like in doing work in the diaspora, when they were shutting down the sugar estates, when there was a commission of inquiry into Walter Rodney's assassination, we deliberately, like, tried to meld those issues. We went, myself and my Indo-Guyanese comrade, we went into South Ozone Park, into the Indo-Guyanese community to petition for justice for Walter Rodney, as well as against the closure of the sugar estates. And at the Labor Day parade, which happens in the West Indian community in Brooklyn, along Eastern Parkway, we went there as well to petition. And there are existing groups here in the diaspora, right? Like, so after Walter Rodney was murdered and some of his compatriots left Guyana for their own safety, one of the things they started here in the US was a journal called The Rodneyite. And The Rodneyite tried to put forward the perspective of an independent left pole, independent working class organization across racial lines. It has since petered out, but there are those people, and I go to their meetings and everything, but it's like, again, you go to some meetings and they happen in the Black part of the Guyanese community, and you go to other meetings and they happen in the Indian part. The challenge is to get them to happen in a concerted, interracial fashion, cross-racial fashion. And that's been the real challenge. But I'll end with this, that about a month ago, I did this event in Chinatown with a group called Asians for Abolitions, fighting for Black Lives Matter within the Asian community. And one of the speakers they invited, I didn't realize, was this young Indo-Guyanese guy. And he talked about the challenge of racism on a personal level that really resonated with me, talking about how the challenge of racism is not just to deal with it in like a theoretical fashion, but to challenge yourself as to how did you learn racism? And he talked about how it started in your home, right? And with your family. And like, I was able to reflect on the ways in which like my family taught me in the anti-Indian racism in Guyana. My grandfather, for example, was known to say, the only good Indian person is a dead one. And I'm using the polite words because he did not call them Indian people. He used the slur coolie that's popular in Guyana. But it's like so bad that my grandfather, who was a man, you know, of great renown, he was like a community activist. One thing about him is that he always had like curly hair, and everyone's like, "Where'd your curly hair come from?" And he never talked about it. On his deathbed, our grandfather admitted to us that he had Indian in his family heritage. Like, that's how like deep and thoroughgoing the issue of racism is in Guyana. So like any blow you can make against that, any step forward you can take against it, like that's our task at this moment.
Thank you so much, Robert. Simón, go ahead.
So a lot of issues to cover in this last part. We'll start with Dan's question. You see, Venezuela, from a working class person who is not into politics, who probably the only thing he knows about the left is that the government claims to be leftist, and the right-wing opposition says that the government is also leftist and socialist. The media, be for or against the government, says that Chavismo is socialist. The international left insists that they support a socialist government in Venezuela. So this person has no way to, it's totally counterintuitive to think that possibly the Venezuelan government is not socialist or is not leftist, when everyone says that it is, be they for or against the government. And what is the reality of Venezuela right now? Why have 5 million people left the country, which is roughly 15% of the population in the last 5 years, these 5 million people? Well, people are leaving because they have wages which are almost non-existent, $5 a month, $1 a month. The minimum wage right now is, according to the official exchange rate, is about $1 a month. So it's really semi-slavery conditions imposed by the Chavismo dictatorship. In those conditions, obviously, most people, even working class people and people who formerly supported Chavez, will say, well, we are tired of this socialism. We don't want, it's enough socialism. 20 years and with $1 wages. And this is inside Venezuela. Those who get out of Venezuela possibly can find out that there is a different left, that also the types of problems that working people face in other countries are also very rough, because when you live in such extreme conditions as in Venezuela, it's easy to imagine that other countries are really much better off, and to not think of working class problems in those countries are as very important, because the burden that you have is so big. So there has been this shift to the right, at least on a superficial level. People think, well, we're against Chavismo and therefore against socialism, which has to do with, of course, just as the fact that Chavismo came into power and that it claimed to be socialist had to do with class struggle and with the historical process, in the sense that it gave prestige to Chavismo to claim to be of the left, because people were organizing and struggling. Well, as this government managed to blow a severe defeat into the working class and into the self-organized sectors of Venezuelan society, this defeat translates into conscience in the sense of rejection for leftist or socialist ideas. and especially in the way that those socialist or leftist ideas are portrayed by the Venezuelan government. One thing I find with Venezuelan immigrants in Latin America is that as they find out that there are leftists who are not Chavistas, which is also not very easy because most of the left is in fact Chavista, but those who come into contact with a more heterogeneous left, well, they come to reassess their notions of what is really happening in Venezuela. But the Venezuelans that are worst off, they go out of Venezuela walking. They walk through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. Sometimes they even get to Chile or to Argentina walking. The people that go out walking, they might have $10 in their pocket or $20 in their pocket and maybe a change of clothes in a backpack. That's the conditions of most people that are going out of Venezuela. Those who get to the US are better off in many senses. And also there's the fact that the US has a long-term Venezuelan community, which was living there from before all of these recent crises. So perhaps there are differences in the Venezuelan community in the US and Venezuelan communities in other countries. But the starting point is that we have to understand why there is this this sentiment. In relation to so I sort of talked also on what is the problem with a lot of the left and the relationship to Venezuela. I would say that it's probably similar to what happens to Syrians. Syrians have to endure the fact that most of the left is either indifferent or actively supporting a genocidal dictatorship. So when the government you hate is, you see that it's supported by the left, you have to be very prejudiced against the actually existing left or the main currents in it. What we need is a type of solidarity that rejects U.S. imperialism, all U.S. intervention, that rejects the terrible effects that oil sanctions have in the Venezuelan economy, especially for the poor people. The Bolivarian bourgeoisie will not suffer, of course. And at the same time, be clear about the fact that socialists will not shed a tear when Maduro is taken down by the people. We will not move a muscle to defend Maduro, and we consider him to be a criminal, and really to hold them to the same standard we hold other capitalist countries or governments, that we don't have a double standard. That's what we can demand of comrades in other countries. I don't know if there's anything, perhaps if there's a question, I will elaborate more.
We have a question from Javier for you, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask for him. He was asking whether you can discuss the communes in Venezuela, like what are the communes, how do they work? Are they workers' councils or cooperatives? Are they officialist, autonomous, or do they combine the two?
Okay, so in 2005 or 6, when the Venezuelan government started stating that it would try to evolve into a 21st century socialism. And in 2007, it created this official party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, created and led by Chavez. Before, it was a constellation of different parties, most of them pre-existing left reformist parties. And the creation of this unified party of Chavismo has a specific goal, which is to put an end to all self-autonomous organizing of the working class and of the popular sectors. It will be a corporative apparatus to discipline the Venezuelan people and to avoid having this, in the military perspective, anarchic process of organizing and struggling and taking to the streets. Well, no, if this is a socialist country and government, the people don't have to struggle anymore. They just have to organize in the official party, and the government will take care if people behave properly. So this very reactionary project, incarnated in the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, is also reflected in specific forms of organizations which are promoted by the states, also with the same goal of avoiding having people organized by themselves. So there are community organizations, but the government says these organizations are anarchic, or they are not strong enough, or they have all type of problems. We will have only one type of organizations, which will be the communal councils, which will be recognized by the government, and it will be the way to change the state from a capitalist state into a communal state. Well, for Marxists, that's not how you change the class character of the state. To have the bourgeoisie organize the people and tell them what to do, that doesn't change the class character of the state. What it does is it gives it more authoritarian characteristics. And what happened at first with the communal councils has happened with other initiatives of organizing that the government promoted, is that the people took it to as a thing to do by themselves. Oh, if now it's communal councils, let's organize communal councils. And so many communal councils at first were actually representing existing communities and their genuine leaders. But of course, the government wouldn't have that. So what the government did is that it mingled in the communal councils. It said, well, this person cannot be a member because he is against the government, or this is not a real leader. This other person should be the one taking the lead in this communal council, or else we will not register it in the ministry, because you had to go through an official recognition process, and that's when the government really controlled the process, because it's not just a slogan organized. It's a bureaucratic process, and when you have to go to an office and get your papers received and recognized by the government, that's when the government says, we will not receive it from you. We already received an application from the PSUV party member from your own community, which that's the communal council we recognize. Regarding workers' councils, they were conceived as anti-union. What Chavez said, even he said it in direct words. He says, union autonomy is poison, is counter-revolutionary poison from the past. We don't need autonomy from a government that is the workers' government. Who would need that? Only if you are against the workers and against the workers' government. And since the government will provide health and subsidized food and everything, and they will solve all of your problems, you don't need to ask for wages. You don't need to struggle for good wages. What you need is political participation. So the workers' councils will not have what unions have, which is legal protections from layoffs. When you're a union member, it's harder for you to be fired from your job. Well, workers' councils do not have that. Also because you are supposing that why would you be fired by a workers' government if you behave correctly? And so it's all of this reactionary apparatus that is built by the government. The communes are supposed to be articulations of communal councils. So a commune would be like at the larger level what communal councils are at the local level. But they really do not exist as autonomous forms of organization. They exist as appendices to the state and to the official party, and that's the way they function. And they even function to break strikes of workers, to attack the mobilizations of the community and of the workers when possible. They are also linked to the militia organizing, which is also not normal, popular, what you would call the popular militia, but it's actually part of the armed forces. And so you always have to be cutting through all the Orwellian language and all of the double speak to see what is the real phenomenon. And that's what we would ask also of people to not take at face value what the government says of itself and what it calls workers or popular councils, but to really see how they function and what they are.
Thank you, Simon. Let's, we have Rosie on stack, but Robert has to leave fairly soon. So I'm going to ask Robert a question for him, then we'll go back to Rocio. So Robert has a question from Juan Pablo that says, do you expect the new PPPC government to align themselves more with the US in order to protect its border?
So I think the current government will be aligning itself more with the US. I think the official signal of that was a recent video by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and what they really want to do is build a military base in Guyana to threaten Venezuela, right? And the previous administration was more resistant to that than this administration. I mean, it's very telling to me. Like, I followed the Facebook pages of the coalition government that just got out of power and the People's Progressive Party that's currently in power. And when Trump came to power, they both sent like messages congratulating him, right? Even though like there's a fair number of Guyanese immigrants who would be facing deportation under Trump. They don't care. The real thing is about building favor with the US government. And even though it's the case that this current government will cooperate with the US, the reality is part of the reason they lost office, right, is that they no longer had the backing and support of the US. That in 2014, around that time, the People's Progressive Party had become such an arrogant government that one of the things they did was just like cuss out the US ambassador at a party. They just got all drunk and like cussed them out. So the US was like, God, we can't really continue to back this government. And the US actually, and many people believe, helped the formation of the coalition that got the People's Progressive Party out of power. But so yeah, they will support the US, but it's, you know, obviously in a very opportunistic way that they'll support the United States. And after Pompeo left, the announcement was that Guyana and the US will be training military forces to run patrols along the Guyana-Venezuelan border. Like that was the outcome of that meeting, of his meeting in Guyana. So it's definitely one of, and this is what the opposition, the now opposition, has said, that like their claim is that they were fraudulently put out of power through a conspiracy of the United States government with the People's Progressive Party. And I don't know if you guys know like the whole drama of how this election this year came to be, but in December 2018, in Guyana, there was a no confidence vote raised against the coalition government by the opposition People's Progressive Party. And at the time, given the makeup of parliament, the motion was sure to fail, except one of the members of the coalition jumped ship and voted for the no confidence motion, which led to it passing. And that member of government was Indo-Guyanese and subsequently whisked out of the country via the Canadian High Commission and has lived in Canada ever since. So there's this conspiracy that instead of legitimately losing the election, which I believe the government did, that the evil forces of the US colluded with the opposition party to get the coalition government out of office. The more plausible story is that the coalition government did not build cross-racial unity. And in a country where racial voting is the thing, and where Indo-Guyanese people make up the plurality of the population, they went back to the old habits of voting for a quote unquote their party. And that's how they got out of power. But the United States clearly is using this as a way to push their further attacks against the Venezuelan people, especially as it's intensified under the Trump regime.
Thank you, Robert. Rocio, can we hear your question now? Yeah.
My question was just for Simón. If you could talk about the protests early last year, especially because here in the United States, I live in LA, in Los Angeles. It was really hard to get people to pay attention to the people's mass protests last year here in the United States because of all Trump's war threats. People wanted to focus on that, understandably, but like a lot of people refused to even look at what those people were doing on the streets. Before Trump really started threatening war, I at least said to my comrades in my socialist group, oh, like, look, in the slums of Caracas, people are like protesting against Maduro. So if you could talk about that and compare it maybe to 2017 when there were those bigger, I think there were the bigger protests because of the constitutional crisis.
Yeah, Simón.
So yes, last year there were big protests, as you said, and very hard repression. About 40 people killed in January. So this is all in the context of this very severe social and economic crisis. Really, the biggest expression of massive rebellion was in 2017, roughly 3 months of generalized and national-wide spread all over the country protests, and it was possible for the government to fall down at that point. There were all sorts of signs of crisis. There were even some instances where the police, the sector of the police that is in charge of judicial investigations, started shooting and exchanging fire with the military, the National Guard. That type of incidents were beginning to happen. So there was really a lot of decomposing in the regime. The Attorney General resigned and denounced that Maduro had done a coup. But what really saved Maduro was the fact that there wasn't really a massive left opposition party, or at least some sort of mass organization that expressed the will of the people to get rid of the dictatorship. Rather, that void was filled by the right-wing traditional parties, who had no interest really in having any type of democratic revolution, because in fact they were perhaps as scared as Maduro. They were seeing that there was a lot of looting going around. They started accusing the people who participated in the looting, out of hunger, obviously, of being Chavista infiltrators, trying to divide the struggle. They were secretly in talks with the government as well to organize elections. And the government has always been able to take advantage of the fact that this bourgeois character, conservative character of the opposition leadership makes them easily manipulated into going into what they know as their mechanisms for doing politics, which is to go to Norway and sit in a table and talk. They are certainly much more comfortable doing that than in fighting in the streets, which they would never do. And so this betrayal in 2017 led to a severe defeat and to worsening of all of the political conditions in Venezuela. When Guaidó self-proclaimed as an interim government with the support of the US, and there were big expectations that this would lead perhaps to some sort of change, but those expectations have certainly dissolved for most people in Venezuela. And what we have this year, 2020, is a a rising phenomenon of protests for all of these issues, labor, access to electricity, water, cooking gas. And although they are not articulated in any way, they are happening simultaneously in different towns, in different parts. They are in fact dozens a week and hundreds in a month, right? So there is this rising phenomenon of protests without the leadership, without any organic cohesion. That's what I can comment on the protests.
Well, we are just at the end. It's 1 p.m. so Robert has to leave, and we had 2 hours of very good conversation and great questions. So I would like to thank Simón and Robert for joining us today, and I invite everyone who's still here to look at our social media of all the hosts of this event. So Alejandro, I think we'll be able to share them in the chat. Alejandro? Okay, so he's gonna start putting them in. Okay, so you have everything there if you want to stay in touch. And I don't know, thank you so much for everything. Thank you all for coming and for participating in this dialogue. Thank you.